pitch and making pitches is woven throughout lobbying. So it's really essential that we understand how to do this first. So elevator pitch structure. So first, we're going to go through a little bit of the overall structure of a pitch, and these are usually pretty short. It's why it's an elevator pitch. An elevator because the idea is that you only have like an elevator ride from one floor to another to explain something to someone. So in general, like, it shows here, it's one sentence. These parts are very short. It's giving you an overall how to introduce something to someone, an idea, and hopefully get them to be engaged and stay involved. So the first is the intro. This is one sentence. So this is really just the basics. It's any relevant information about yourself that will increase your credibility. So for example, if it's the constitution of a legislator's district, maybe you're a student studying sustainability, maybe you want to give a personal connection to the issue, like, you're someone whose home was flooded by Hurricane Ida. You want to mention that, give that personal context and connection to not only hook them in per se, but to also, establish your credibility to the audience. Also, in terms of that, you want to probably mention the organization you're working with or that you represent, so that they know that you're not only working alone, that you are a part of a larger grassroots audience, and also further builds your credibility. So next is the problem, and this is pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to go into it anyway. For us, this would be the Green Amendment, or this would be the precursor to the Green Amendment. So you might actually realize that we did kind of do a small elevator pitch just recently in the last section. So first we talked about the problem being the underlying issue that there are sacrifice zones across New Jersey, that there are these huge issues like climate change and unpure water, and that human rights are not equated to the legal system. So right now, that problem for us was what I just said. However, the problem can be anything. This is more broad. Problem usually want to state for an elevator pitch in about one sentence. So this is your personal problem. It is something that is affecting you or your community. And essentially, this is why you care. So you want to make this personal. It's even better if for us it was more general because we're doing it to a general audience. But if it's your legislator you're talking to, you want to make that personal to your town, personal to your life, personal to your district, so that they themselves, they're a person as well. They can connect to that too. Next, it's you want to really explain how this is a deeper issue and what you think exactly is, or who is responsible for exactly what's hurting you. You want to get to the root of that problem. Like for us, we talked about the surface level issues. You can see sacrifice zones. We went down to the root issue of the problem, which was human rights are not equated to legal rights. So that was a root problem. It's really important to get to that, in a very short amount of time, obviously, but just really acknowledging that so they can understand the holistic nature of the problem. And then head and heart hook. So that basically means that you want to use both, appealing to someone's head, kind of like logic stats, using rhetorical devices, that would be logos. And then heart is like pathos. That's more moral, emotional appeal. These people, legislators are included, they appeal, and people are more susceptible, depending on the person, to different appeals. One person might be more moved by logic, one person more so maybe by, an emotional personal story. So including both really just casts a broader net and is only going to benefit you in your success of your elevator pitch. So you want to explain really here just why they should care, give that problem statistics, give that personal story. Next, you want to go to the solution. Referring back to that metaphor of what we just did, for us, that was the Green Amendment. We said the root problem is that human rights are not equated to the legal system. Solution, Green Amendment. Not that simple, but just splitting it up. You want to make it as simple as possible for the person. So the solution is around one sentence. You can see these are all around one sentence, pretty short. You want to state the solution, in this case, the Green Amendment. For example, you would say, the Green Amendment protects the right to a clean environment, so it'll help my community. You want to tie in how it will specifically help you and help them, their constituents, confront companies that have been polluting the area. So you want to make sure that it's a personal story, as personal as you can make it. It's okay if it's general, but especially if it's your legislator you're talking to, or someone in your community, like a local official or your mayor or the environmental commission. You want to make it as specific as possible because it's more a personal appeal. And you want to make sure you're stating the solution clearly. And you always want to root back to that root problem of how it will solve that root problem, that one slice of the problem. Because the root of the problem really is that key slice that you're trying to address with your solution, because obviously these problems like climate change and polluted air and water are huge problems. We're only trying to solve a small slice, which is why I mentioned that the Green Amendment is only a tool in the toolbox. You want to make sure that you're talking specifically about a very specific problem and then how it solves that specific problem. And then next we have why now. This is half a sentence, it's half a sentence, meaning just like kind of a clause. So this is really talking about the urgency. And it's important to urge the legislator, in this case, to act now. The Green Amendment is not something that can be waited on. Obviously, climate change, the climate crisis is here now, and communities are hurting now. This is the time to act. And you can talk about the urgency of your specific issue. So not just the Green Amendment, you can say, kind of use a little bit of emotional appeal here too. Like, if we don't act now, the health of community members will deteriorate, which sounds like a very urgent tone, but it kind of sometimes is what you need to get across your point. And you can also talk about, like I said, the urgency of bigger issues like climate change that most people understand. And then finally, as you saw peep there, is the call to action, the other half of that sentence. I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to have a call to action at the end of every single elevator pitch. If you don't have a call to action, then it's going to be like, well, here's the solution and do what you want with it. You want to have something specific. It's almost like a SMART goal at our meetings. It's something that really ties it all in and makes sure that this is not just a one-off conversation, that this will lead and transcend to an action. That's so important. And this puts the audience into the picture, and it's saying how specifically how they can help. And you want this ask to be, as in caps there, specific. So for example, we had, in general, when we're talking to legislators, Fawn and I actually were able to go down to Trenton and talk to some legislators of ourselves. And our asks there, for example, were to tell Scutari and Coughlin, the two VIPs for us, that you want to get the Green Amendment to a vote in January. So that's now. So that's one example of a call to action. You want to make it specific. You want to make it really as short as possible. Maybe you want to ask for a meeting, ask for their contact information for a meeting. Usually try and ask for on one thing or so it can be more specific and they can give it more of an answer. Really just simplifying all this. Obviously, it's only one sentence or so will make it just easier to follow. And that's really, I talked to a legislator specifically, the first person I talked to when we were in Trenton. And he was, I'm around 5 foot. He was around like 6 foot, like 2 or so. He was looking down on me. He's like, listen, I can tell this is your first time. Like, you're really talking way too fast. You just need to slow down, give a very short intro to the problem, your bill or the solution, and then a very like quick call to action. Like, can I have a meeting, or are you available to speak for a meeting? So coming from the people themselves, coming from the audience themselves, keeping it as simple as possible, but still hitting on these few structure points is pretty critical. So most things that we're talking about here are kind of in the realm of a story. So most times you're doing a public speech, it kind of does lend itself best to the audience as a story. So these stories are best to be personal stories. And the storyline, as we just mentioned, is really equivalent to the pitch. So stories have the same structure as a pitch, as we just learned, and it includes the problem, the solution, the ask. And the pitch is really readily customizable for any audience you need. That's why it's very general, but I just went through pretty in detail. That's because it's very easy to customize. You just have to remember to hit those basic and points. these three especially are super important. If you don't remember all five, then remember these: problem, solution, ask. And also the key points of the Green Amendment are in the same realm, the problem being legal rights are not equated to human rights, solution, Green Amendment, ask, can we have a meeting? Something along those lines. Just remember those things and you'll usually be pretty good to go. So next is to put the audience in the story. So the goal here is to convince your audience to take up your given action item. So that's the ask. As I said, the ask is super, super important. If you don't have this ask, then you're not going to be able to even incorporate the audience into the story. It's like just talking at them instead of trying to include them. So you want to include the audience into the story, explain how they can be a part of the solution and can help remedy this problem. So that's why the ask is just so critical. And, kind of restating what I there, emphasizing that the ask is just so important, especially with legislators who have a lot in their minds. Make a clear and direct ask, and that will greatly help you.
Yeah, so since we are and this is very Green Amendment specific, this slide and probably the next one too, since we're a unified campaign, we like to have some keywords and phrases, some type of stock language for everybody to use to keep our message really solid and consistent. And it makes it a lot more memorable when we're using the same wording over and over again. People remember what the Green Amendment is about when we say clean air, clean water, healthy environments over and over again, maybe several times a meeting or maybe once or twice during our pitch, especially if they're hearing that pitch from multiple people. And it also makes it easier for us to remember, right? So things like the rights to pure air, clean water, stable climate, and healthy environment, slightly wordier one, but it really is essential tenet of the Green Amendment. Words like basic human rights, right? That's one of our key messages, that we want to make human rights legal rights. And finally, simply the word right, talking about how this goes in the Bill of Rights. This is our human right. This wants to just incorporate these key legal rights into our Constitution. All of these are really useful. And it's also helpful for you if you're lobbying, you're ever lost, you get nervous, you don't know how to phrase something. These are some good, consistent points to always go back to that can help you out. Yeah, inalienable rights as kind of like a subsection of those rights, and all people, every person. Key points and ideas, again, this is pretty Green Amendment specific. Certain points need to be consistently given, right? If we have a bunch of people talking to the same legislator, we want to make sure that all of those different people are giving a consistent message, obviously with their own personal stories, their own personal angles going at it with the same central ask or idea. So first, we want to make sure we cover what is the problem? Well, our environmental rights are not legally protected. Next, what is the solution? Obviously, the Green Amendment, right? We want to discuss how the Green Amendment is a solution that is directly tied to the problem that we just talked about. Next, what is the Green Amendment? Well, it's a constitutional amendment that adds environmental rights to our Bill of Rights. So again, when we're explaining the Green Amendment, it's really important to tie it back to the problem, especially if we talk about a very specific problem that's within our community, that it may not be obvious within just these simple definitions, how the two of them connect. And then finally, this is our ask or call to action. What do we want? We want the audience to support us in getting a Green Amendment. And it depends on who the audience is, what that ask will be. It can be having a meeting. It can be contacting the legislators. It can be co-sponsoring the bill if you are a legislator. It really depends.
Yeah, so just expanding upon what Svan just wrote, there really are some other good topping points that are pretty Green Amendment specific, but are still really important to note. So these are really important just to reference during any of your discussions, with a legislator, with a friend, with really anyone you're talking to and introducing the Green Amendment, usually for the first time. So you really want to compare this to other Bill of Rights. And you can see I keep on saying right, as Svan just said, right is just really central to the Green Amendment. So the first bullet, this really is just talking about alleviating environmental rights when situated along with those other American love rights, as I previously mentioned in the Bill of Rights section, like the freedom of speech. It not alleviates, elevates. So the freedom of speech, religion, the right to bear arms, those are all really deeply held American values. And it is really important to put the Green Amendment on that same pedestal. And that's why the Bill of Rights section is so important and key to the Green Amendment and how it's situated. So another good talking point to bring up is that you may assume these basic rights to live are protected, but no, that's something I really like to say. I really like to emphasize how fundamental and kind of necessary that these rights are, like, pure water, clean air. I can't live without that. You may assume that these basic rights to live are protected, but no, you can just see how that naturally fits in. And it kind of emphasizes how self-explanatory the amendment is, and kind of surprising that we don't have one already. And it may seem obvious that we don't have this, that we should have this, but we don't. It's kind of just common sense. And really make sure you emphasize the part that, you need these rights to live, to survive. That's super important. So another good thing we can do as students is we can use that climate change ethos type thing. So in general, New Jersey is a Democratic majority and it is a coastal state. So most legislators in general, most will not deny that climate change is at least real. And as young people, we have that strong credibility and association with climate change. And as seen in the media, kind of not rightfully so, but a lot of times we're kind of equated with climate change activism. So it's not exactly right, but it's kind of the way some older people think about it. So we can kind of use that to our advantage. And people in general, the legislators, they kind of sometimes know this might be our top priority and they know why. And you can really make a strong personal story, no matter who you are, if you're a young person, saying climate change is going to affect my future more than it will affect yours, and more than it will affect my grandchildren's more than it will affect mine, and keep on going. It is super important to the youth in general, since it is long withstanding, and you can always use that when talking about the Green Amendment. And finally, any local applicable environmental issue, especially when you're talking to a local legislator or even a town mayor or a local environmental commission, that is super important. And it really depends on who you're pitching. If it's to a legislator or a club, you want to explain it to them into a problem and relate it back to an issue that the Green Amendment could potentially solve within their community, something that they might see, maybe an issue. If it's in Newark, maybe the Ironbound community, you want to talk about that and their lack of clean air. And you can talk about how they could use the Green Amendment to help alleviate that suffering. And if you're a legislator, you actually want to talk about a hot seat issue as well. So if this is a little bit more like political, but if it's like a really popular issue or a really well-known issue in their district, if it's something they might be able to fix with the Green Amendment, then it's something good to mention too, because in their mind, they'll be thinking, oh, if I fix this, or if the Green Amendment can be used and applied to this, maybe they'll make me more popular. And, legislators, a lot of times they're politicians, they're trying to get votes. So good to play into that.
So some tips and tricks that are applicable, not just to the Green Amendment, but to really anything you're lobbying about. First, brevity. Brevity is incredibly important in real life. Your meeting may sometimes be a sit-down meeting, but sometimes it's just catching someone in the hallway for 30 seconds. So you need to be prepared for both having a longer extended conversation about your issue, as well as having to tell somebody about your issue in 10, 20, 30 seconds. And both can be equally as hard, and both have their pros and cons. So you can always extend whatever you're talking about, but brevity is really the hard part, because obviously if we're lobbying about it, we all know a lot about our issue. We all care a lot about our issue. We need to learn how to condense it into something brief and something that contains the most important information for whoever we're talking to. So again, that elevator pitch, think about something that takes you less than 30 seconds. And that doesn't just mean you talk extremely fast and cram 3 minutes worth of talking into 1 minute. You want to obviously still make it understandable and show that you're confident and you're not rushing through this. And again, you can lengthen it as needed, and you want to avoid redundancy. That's probably the easiest way to make your talk brief. Avoid repetition. And yes, we do use key phrases a lot. If we need to, and that's a good way to lengthen as needed, to repeat key things. But if we are aiming for a 30-second pitch, don't repeat anything. This is really important. A lot of people, their first times get nervous and they try and memorize a specific pitch, but don't memorize it. Practice it until you know it. This will make you the most fluent on the issue, and it will make you able to extend it or condense it as you need to aim for both that brevity, but also be able to lengthen for a longer meeting, and also adjust for the audience to know how to change your ask, or how this issue may apply to different people in different way. Because if you really know the pitch well, it's going to be a lot easier for you to go out and say it than if you just memorize a script. Next, you want to research your audience and make sure you're tailoring your pitch. So we'll talk more about how to research specific audiences, choosing an audience, power, and eventually power mapping. But whether or not you're talking to a legislator or a local official, or simply just people in your school or in your community, you want to make sure you know your audience, you know what they care about, even if it's not necessarily research, like going online, just thinking about, what do I know about this person? What are their interests? What are their passions? And then tailor the pitch to relate to what they're concerned about. Because it's a lot easier to get someone to pay attention to something they already care about than to start caring about something totally new and unrelated. Next, this is really related to the redundancy and brevity pieces. You want to recognize the essential parts of your pitch and what's just nice to have. And then you can keep the nice parts to have, obviously, if you have the time. But if you know what you don't necessarily need, what isn't vital, then you can cut it down as needed, just to the essential points if you are put in a position where you do have to give like an under 60-second elevator pitch. And then finally, come prepared to give both statistics, like appeal to the head part, and also talk about yourself, appealing to more of the heart, because different people will respond in different ways. So at first, especially if you're having a longer meeting, you can start with both. And then when you see like what they care about more, or if you already know the person, you know what they respond to the most, then you can shift gears and kind of focus on what is going to be more effective to your audience. So this essentially means know your story really well, know the factual side of things, and also the emotional side as well. So next, we're going to go more in depth into lobbying. So how you can take all of this pitch stuff, if you're working on the Green Amendment, how you can take this Green Amendment stuff and apply it in an actual lobbying setting. So first, what is lobbying? Well, lobbying is any form of direct contact with a legislator, with local officials, with officials on maybe more of a national level, so people in Congress, that sort of thing. We really focus on state assembly people and senators because for our campaign, the Green Amendment is a state bill. That's where we're focusing our attention, sometimes on the local level as well, but really on the state level. Though, of course, your specifically who you're targeting with your lobbying is going to depend on what campaign you're running and what your goals are. There's different tactics, and we'll go over each in more detail for lobbying. You can do phone banking, emailing, meetings, and this is highlighted because meetings, whether they're virtual or in person, are probably the most effective lobbying tactic that you can take. And finally, with events, and this means attending events that they're already holding, particularly around campaign season, or holding events like, for instance, earlier in, not this year anymore, earlier last year, our partner organization, Bye Bye Plastic Bags, held an event for legislators, and we had, I think, like 10 or so legislators or their staff come and attend that event to get informed on the Green Amendment, which was great turnout. So both those types of events count. And why is lobbying so important? Well, generally, lobbying provides us with direct influence, right? So it allows us to get right in front of our legislators, or in the case of a phone call or an email, directly reach them in some way. So we're not like indirectly influencing them through other people, they're hearing directly from us. Next, it's proof of support. So if a legislator is getting a ton of phone calls in, it's getting a ton of emails and letters in, and then you want to talk to them about an issue, well, you have a bunch of proof to show that, hey, a lot of people care about this, because a lot of people have been reaching out to you already, and it kind of preps the legislator for those types of conversations and to make decisions like voting yes or no on whatever you're working on. It also helps with relationship building. So yes, we're always thinking about our current goal, right? The bill we want to pass today, the project we want to stop or start today, right? But building long-term relationships with legislators can be really valuable, and having particularly those face-to-face meetings where they get to know who you are, your work, you get to know their priorities, what's important to their district and to their constituents. That is really important, and that's a really type of long-term benefit to lobbying. And also it simply builds power. So relationship building builds you power, proof of support builds you power, direct influence builds you power. And when legislators see the face of your organization, they see different people from this organization, they become more aware of you, and they start to think of you more as a player in the political arena, and they consider what your priorities are and what you have to say a lot more than if you were coming like totally out of the blue. They've never heard of you before. Meetings, and like I mentioned before, meetings and events really hold the most weight by far out of any lobbying tactic. Yes, a ton of phone calls and a ton of emails and a ton of letters are great, but in terms of individual actions that can be taken, that face-to-face time where you're dedicating more of your time and they are actually seeing you face-to-face as a human, and you can have a two-way conversation, is really the most powerful lobbying tactic there is. And then finally, just a quick plug, we do have a lobbying folder. So if you go to the NJCC folder and then you find your way through the campaigns folder to the Green Amendments folder, there is a lobbying coordinator folder and a folder full of resources for lobbying there. So this includes phone call scripts, this includes sample emails, Green Amendment like I think it's FAQ. So if someone's asking a question you don't know, you can refer to that, quick fact sheet, student talking points, many different resources we've created over the past over a year to help students with these types of events and these types of lobbying strategies.
Yeah, so I just put that in the chat. There's the Google Drive folder. There's a lot of good information in there. Like Svan said, it's really just good for you to check up on that afterwards, and it's where we pull a lot of our lobbying stuff from. So if you're interested in really lobbying with us, that's a great way just to, on your own time, also look at that. So now we know what lobbying is, why it's important, and how it relates to our campaign. So probably all wondering, how do you actually lobby? So that's our next part. And Svan mentioned briefly, there's many different ways to lobby, but at the core of lobbying, it is about strategy. Oftentimes when we hear of lobbyists, we think of probably big corporations, often in Washington, D.C. It's a huge industry and it's been around for a long, long time. So lobbying is really at its heart about strategy. And power mapping, as Svan mentioned, is really key overall to the strategy and planning of lobbying. So there's many different aspects of power mapping that you have to consider. So the first is your target. That's kind of the person you're trying to speak with. So maybe for me, since my legislators are, I'm 25th, so I want to talk to Oregon, Bucco, and Bergen. And I also, everyone's target, in this case, it's legislators, but for other cases, it could be other things. For us as state legislators, maybe for everyone that's Scutari, Senate President, Assembly, Speaker Coughlin, those targets is important to know so you can kind of plan everything else around that target. So you also think about your connections. So I guess that'd be my connections. My connections, you want to think about who are our ties at NJCC? Who are we partnered with that could potentially help us? Who has a connection to that legislator? Who maybe do I know in my community who might have some kind of connection? Maybe my best friend's, her sister is friends with the son of the legislator. It can be that kind of crazy and distant, but if you make that connection, that personal connection, you're drastically more likely to get a meaningful response. You also want to think about the target circle, their circle. That kind of is including their inner circle, outer circle. So the inner circle for them is like their closest affiliates. And you can kind of consider like, how do your connections play into that? Are your connections in the inner circle? Are they in the outer circle, the farthest circle? And you also consider, where are you? You're most likely, most of us will probably be in the outer circle, the farthest circle away from the legislators. But if you are a constituent, and that already puts you somewhat on that outer circle, because when we were talking to Assemblyman McKeon, who's the prime co-sponsor of the bill in the Assembly, we had him on the podcast, and Daniel and I co-host the podcast, and he's Svan and Daniel's legislator. And he said to us, we asked him, like, what was really effective? What made you want to come meet with us? And one of the key first things he said was, first of all, while this is all really important, one of the key reasons why I even came and spent so much time, and he even spoke with us for a while in person as well, is just because Svan and Daniel are both constituents. They both grew up in like the same town, have like connection to the schools and community. So that plays a huge impact. So one of the key things you learn about strategy here is when you think about your leverage and your connections, often that really just leads you towards your own legislators. It's kind of their job, right, to represent you, and you already have that connection. So it's most effective when constituents are speaking directly to their own legislators. And then we have your leverage. That can be electoral, like I said, being a constituent, your moral leverage. Maybe you can say, like, I'm a student, make them kind of feel bad. We've done that too. Maybe your, legal leverage, if you have, maybe students don't have that, but it's an option. Maybe your disruptive leverage. That's not really usually what we're going with, but it's different options that you can use. And then creating a visual map. I'm not sure if we've actually tried this, but it is recommended with power mapping in the trainings to create a visual map, like of your target in the middle, and then kind of your connections, like what connections do you have, what leverage do you have, and kind of drawing it out to try and better visualize it. Certain people might have better ways of organizing things. We do it in a spreadsheet, but I know visual learner and that whole stuff is kind of like fake science. But if you're a visual learner, maybe this would be helpful. So, that strategy in general is just very important, and creating a visual map might help you consolidate all of these ideas into one idea. And then you also want to use field products. So field product meaning it is grassroots, it appeals to the people. Legislators at the end of the day are here to respond to the people, to react to the people, and to serve the people. Even though they might not always be like that, that kind of is at the end of the day the purpose and the goal. So we kind of want to remind them of that. We want to remind them of, that people do care about it, and we want to bring forth if we do have any evidence that people do care, especially their constituents. So this can include a petition. We have a student petition, and we have also a general, I believe, Green Amendment petition. You can send calls and letters. So we'll talk about that more later, but if you're going to go into maybe a meeting, you mentioned that you called them, that you sent them a letter, really just mention any of these field products, things that show that there is grassroots support, because at the end of the day, they're there to act on what their constituents believe in and what other legislators are acting on. So everything makes a difference. You can use LTEs, which are letters to the editor and the press in general, like an op-ed, press release, events like Swan mentioned with bioplastic bags. They had a webinar where they had legislators there and discussed the Green Amendment, and it was really effective. Many legislators co-sponsored, meaning like they supported the bill after that. And just in general, going over grassroots again, grassroots is support from the community, constituents, possibly like is an example of being in the meeting. If you have constituents in the meeting, that's grassroots. That's support from people specifically from their district or their community. Grass tops is more endorsements, and we've been thinking about including this more like from small businesses and from businesses, since that is a big concern that the Green Amendment will halt economic growth or halt economic progress, where as we see in New York, Pennsylvania, Montana, it's not true. So we're thinking potentially of maybe having some endorsements or some, mentions from businesses. This can be like a leadership. This can be someone of kind of at the top. It means, they're not just a person, they're more of like an organization. So that's grass tops. And now Spawn's gonna go more into detail about first, like this is number one, it's kind of split into like different sections. So one's the overall strategy, kind of like framework. And then two is going over like the slower commitment actions, their pros and cons. And then three is going over the meetings, which are key ideal action.
Yeah, and I do realize we are running up to the hour pretty soon, so we will try and hurry up and really focus on that meetings part and less so on those low commitment actions, because most of them are pretty self-explanatory. So first is calling. There's various pros to it. Obviously, it's very low commitment. You can do a call in 1 minute and 30 seconds. In fact, it should be pretty short. Nobody really needs training to do a call. You can read it off a script. You just pull up the right number to call, and it's very easy. And it's middle impact. So it's not the lowest thing you can do. And when legislators do get calls, they do have their staff receive them, note it down, and they take note, especially when it is a high volume of calls. Cons, however, it requires several, at least probably a lot of calls to actually make an impact this way, right? It's middle impact, meaning it's not the highest impact either, even though it's not the lowest. And then steps to making a call. Again, this is pretty self-explanatory. You want to make one central point. You have 1 minute and 30 seconds. This is essentially going to be your elevator pitch. You want to have a script and an outline that includes your connection to the legislator, preferably saying, hey, I'm a constituent. You want to give facts, basically supporting evidence. So this is going to be like the problem and solution part of that pitch. And then finally the ask, which is a central part of the pitch structure, and also phone call scripts, because that's always what you want to end on, and what you want them to remember. And finally, provide your full name and address, because the address just proves that you're a constituent. And if they live in the same town as you, a lot of times when we were talking to our own legislator, I was asked this today when I met with my Senator Cody, what neighborhood do you live in? Because they want to make that personal connection to you. Next, letters and emails. These also have various pros. They're easy and fast, especially automated emails. You can have anybody send those in a minute. Automated emails are also really great because they're trackable. So we have an Action Network automated emails going for the Green Amendment. And I think we've had maybe like 400 plus people send emails that way. And each person is emailing 5 different legislators. They're 3 plus Coughlin, and first Sweeney, now Scutari. So that is a lot of emails that's going out, and you're able to track that and see what districts are being targeted and what legislators are being targeted the most. Handwritten letters are also useful. They add a really nice personal touch to lobbying as well. And like with phone calls, this requires no training. Cons, however, it's minimal impact, particularly emails. Emails can get lost easily and maybe won't be seen. And it requires many. So with those automated emails, they're great because you can get out a high volume of them. But if you don't make that high volume and get a lot of people sending those emails, it's a lot less effective. Steps to this, of course, this is again pretty self-explanatory. Like with calls, make one central point, have a template that everyone's following that includes parts where they can insert their own personal story. You want to include personal aspects, particularly in those types of handwritten letters, but a template is still useful to keep everyone on track because emails particularly should be short. And then finally, again, you really, really need to send many of these for them to be effective. Next is social media. And a lot of people don't think of social media as lobbying, but it's actually a really effective lobbying tactic, particularly because it's public. So with letters and phone calls and emails, you can call the legislator and they can ignore you and no one will ever know it, particularly if you have a smaller volume going in. But with social media posts, you post and you tag them, and they and all of their followers can then see that post, and all of your followers, right? So a lot more people at least are going to be knowing about what's happening, are going to be tuned into this issue. So there's more accountability there because it's public. And also it's kind of a 2 birds in 1 stone kind of thing. You're lobbying them and you're also raising awareness, right? By talking about the Green Amendment, by talking about whatever issue you're lobbying for in a public space. It's also really easy and fast, and you don't need to train anyone, just like with emails, but again, it's public. Cons, of course, is that the impact depends, particularly with smaller legislators. Local officials may not be on social media. It's remarkable how many legislators don't have really active accounts. So especially since many of them are on Twitter, which not many, or Facebook, which not many young people are on. So Instagram, which is where most of our youth power is not really a hotspot for legislator activity. So that can be a block. And again, it requires many posts, maybe not as many as emails because of that public aspect, but you still want to have many posts. Steps, I'm sure all of us post on social media, pretty simple. You want to be really brief. Focus on your ask. Don't really think so much about the personal aspects or about problem and solution parts. Just, this is what I want, and this is what I want you to do about it. And then finally, tag legislators and their partners. Obviously, tag them so that they see it, and tag your own partners so your partners know to share the post.
Okay, so we know it's late and we're almost rounding an hour, but this is really the last key topic, these lobbying meetings. And arguably, lobbying meetings are the most important almost out of anything we've talked about this whole night. So please stay focused, and we're nearing the end. Just know that this is very important and you should definitely listen to this part. So first you can talk about, like, think about in your mind, should you have a meeting? These are the pros and the cons. And it's almost the opposite of a lot of the other ones. So it is a 2-way conversation, meaning that you get to know them and get to know their interests, and you can kind of form that connection. And they also get to know you in the same way that you get to form that connection for other future issues you might talk about. You'll have that solid connection, not just with yourself, but if you mention your organization, also with the organization. And it also is a time commitment, which the time commitment honestly isn't too bad. It may be more than the other ones, but it definitely is more effective. It is hugely more effective to I'm sure, as you guys can think, to just see a post one-off. Think about if you're a legislator, you're scrolling through Instagram, maybe you're not scrolling through Instagram. If you're looking at Facebook, maybe your staffer is looking at Facebook and they see one post about the Green Amendment or 2 tags. They're like, oh, okay, that's a thing. Maybe they remember, then they forget a few days or a few seconds later. If you meet with them and you follow up with them, as we'll talk about later, that is just hugely important. And when you meet with someone, obviously you're way more likely to remember it than a one-off phone call or one email you got in the thousands of emails you got that day. So getting an e-meeting is hugely effective, and that's why is our key goal, because obviously if we meet with legislators and we're really pushing for the Green Amendment, that is our best chance of actually getting it passed. There are some cons though. You do have to have this training. Stuff like this is kind of crucial since legislators, you don't want to go in unprepared. It's not something you can kind of just wing. It's something you want to have that's strategic, that you have, an outline, an agenda, as we're going to talk about, because these people are really important, and how you act during a lobbying meeting will reflect not just, our campaign and our movement, but also just the Green Amendment as a whole. And you don't want to badly represent the Green Amendment or our campaign, because that could, at the end of the day, maybe turn someone to not be as pro Green Amendment as they could have been, or could be neutral instead of pro. So it's definitely very important to be trained and to be prepared. And also it is high commitment, meaning that, it is a higher time commitment, more time commitment than our previous actions like social media. You can just post very quickly. Whereas a meeting, like I said, you have to prep for it, and you have to actually have that meeting, usually maybe about an hour or 30 minutes. And then you also have to have that follow-up too. So, that comes at a cost, right? So like, it's like an indirect relationship, less time commitment, usually less effective, more time commitment, usually more effective. And then, as I keep on saying, it's super, super important to prepare for these meetings. You want to set up a meeting, usually with a staffer, because the legislators themselves are very busy. Even at the state level, they're pretty busy people. And usually you're going to be setting up with a staffer. That's kind of their job. Pretty much every legislator has some kind of staffer, part-time, or at least shared with someone else. So the staffer is really important as kind of your point of contact. Sometimes you even just meet with the staffer themselves if they're really busy or important legislator. So they're going to be kind of your point person, at least for setting up the meeting and potentially for even meeting. So preparing the agenda and talking points, as I said, are a key part to preparation for these meetings. Preparing that agenda is kind of putting out those talking points. You want to come in with a plan, you want to come in with a strategy, and you want to play upon all those different talking points and elevator pitch we talked about earlier. You want to hit on all those points, but obviously it's a meeting. It's not an elevator pitch. You can talk about that in much more detail, but it kind of has a similar structure. And you also want to prepare materials. You somewhat of an action item usually, or an ask, is usually want to leave them with a type of resource. So when we went to lobbying in the Capitol, which was one of my favorite things I've probably ever done, you went in, and one of the first things David, our lobbying expert, he's been doing this around 30 years. One of the first things he told us was, you want to make sure that you are, doing that short elevator pitch, right? But you want to always, if possible, give them an actual physical piece of paper or a takeaway. That is super important. It is reminding them of your meeting, giving proof of your meeting, and maybe it will just be put on their, maybe it will be put on their desk. They'll never look at it again, but subconsciously they'll also see it. Kind of similar to what David said about giving out books potentially. There's a Green Amendment book. So if they put the Green Amendment book on their shelf and they just subconsciously see it, then you're having an impact, even if they're not realizing it. So by giving out those materials, it gives them opportunity, especially if it's like a very short elevator pitch or even a meeting itself, to give them opportunity to read more about the amendment, because oftentimes legislators want to be sure, reasonably about what they're supporting. So giving them those materials will give them an opportunity to read more into the issue beyond what you can tell them at a meeting. So next we'll talk about the agenda, which is pretty important. This is the actual setup of the meeting, the structure. You want to set your own agenda. You want to not have them kind of run the meeting. You want to be running it yourself, because these legislators, sometimes they will, they're used to talking and sometimes not saying, no offense, the stuff that is the most productive. They want to be, making themselves look the best. Sometimes they're talking about what they've done and what they did. what they want to do, their plans, their goals, instead of having it be about them and what they want to just talk about mindlessly. You want it to be talking about you and what you want to be talking about your problem, your solution, your ask. That should be the key focus and should be structured that way, not so free form that they'll be able to just kind of tell their stories and do whatever they want. And it also builds your credibility as well, especially as students. If you come in, for business and you come in prepared, that would definitely be a big, huge issue. And it seems like we're back. That's good. So here are the steps. Here are the steps here. So first of all, you want to include your intros. That's both, it's a two-way conversation, right? So it's both including the introduction for yourself, but also the introduction for the legislator. You want to get to know them better. They are a person. You have to play that. I just said that you want to make it like, structured enough and more formal enough that you're kind of setting an agenda, but at the same time, kind of like when you do intros in our meetings, you still want to make that personable. You still want to include that personal element, make that connection. And also you want to include in that intro then the organization that's backing you. So for us, that's, green amendments for the generations. That's the broader movement, but also mention the New Jersey Student Sustainability Coalition in our campaign. So that's the intros. In the background, you want to give the background specifically on the issue. For us, obviously, the Green Amendment. And then you want to kind of see what they know about it. Sometimes we're meeting with co-sponsors who presumably you think would know more about the Green Amendment, but sometimes they actually don't know anything about the Green Amendment like we experienced. Sometimes they actually know a lot more than you think. So you kind of want to first see what they might know about it in a series of kind of like probing questions like, have you heard about the Green Amendment before? Or did you know that the Green Amendment secures the right to pure air, clean water, stable climate, healthy environment, and kind of see how they react. And then you want to kind of leave a little bit of flexibility to kind of best situate it in terms of their background knowledge. And then the third is your argument. You want to kind of give that problem solution. You want to include the argument for why the Green Amendment is important, and it's important specifically to their district. So you want to probably include like a local issue that will be impacted by the Green Amendment, specifically something maybe that is widely known that might make them popular if they're able to fix it. And then the ask is the final part. And you can see how this really does, like I said, follow that basic pitch structure. The pitch structure is especially important when you're doing like an in-person lobbying, when you only have a few seconds with them or a few sentences, but it still kind of follows the meeting structure as well. So this pitch is just so fundamental. So the ask is as important with the pitch. It is also important here with the meeting agenda. And it really is the most important part. It should be clear, should be reasonable, and you really should be able to gauge what your ask is before the meeting. So you kind of want to think about before the meeting what your ask would be, because you don't want to come in not knowing what your ask is since it's so important. That's one of the key parts of prep. So what we do is talk to David, because asking legislators specific things are pretty crucial, and you don't want to mess that up or like ask them something that's not in their best interest. So usually we ask David kind of what is the best thing to ask the specific legislator at this time. Maybe it will be ask them to urge Sweeney for a hearing. Maybe it's asking them to talk to Smith about moving this onto the floor. It really will depend on their specific connections, and depending on, if they're in the Assembly, the Senate, and depending on where the Green Amendment is at that time. So really just refer back to us, and we'll refer to David, because having that ask as specified to the legislator as possible and the situation at hand is really important. And then next steps, this is really important. We're going to talk about this next on follow-up, but you want to make sure that you are going to follow up with your legislator. You want to not have this be like a one-off meeting. Maybe you won't meet with them again, not what I mean, but you want to make sure that the topics that you're talking about here are not going to just leave their mind after this meeting. While meetings are the most effective, you still need that secure follow-up to really make a difference and to really make sure that ask is going to be implemented the way you want it to. So really make sure that you solidify that next step. You talk about how oh, thank you, Senator Smith. I'll be following up with your office, your staffer this upcoming week, and I'll be sending you the materials we talked about. Or you'll give them anything they might have requested. So you really want to make sure you're taking that next step. And then just some final tips here. Go through these pretty quickly. You want to be organized. It's kind of self-explanatory. I've gone over that quite a bit. You can tell just you want to have everything together. Stick to the agenda. This is also pretty important. It's almost like a regular meeting, just a little bit higher stakes since they are a target. So you want to really stick to that agenda. Try not to get sidetracked too much. It's good maybe if it's like a personal connection, that's fine, but make sure you're always sticking to that and getting back to that problem, that solution, and that ask. And then kind of what I said in the last slide, you want to prepare yourself with these materials and that evidence, both personal and statistical. So statistical meaning maybe you want to bring up an issue specifically in the numbers. Maybe if you live in a coastal community, how much are rising sea levels meant to impact economic development at the shore? Maybe you want to talk about that if there's any kind of research done in your community, and you want to talk about maybe how your specific home was flooded at this past winter. Something along those lines, kind of just made up, but you want to have that prepared. Follow-up, as I said, is super crucial. It kind of goes along with that ask bit. It's essential, it really is. The steps here are as follows. You want to give materials, and these materials, just this meeting will be accessible to you, these slides, so you can always go back to look at this if you don't remember what these materials are right now, if you're not taking notes. So these materials would include the Green Amendment talking points, what is the Green Amendment handout, and there's also a Green Amendment quick facts, which is specifically for printing if it's an in-person meeting, which most of them are actually virtual meetings. So that's something good to note as well. So the follow-up is usually done over email, however you set up the email, however you set up the meeting, whoever's email you used, likely it's going to be the person you're going to be following up with. So if it's a staffer who you met with or the legislator themselves, you want to thank the staffer, thank the legislator for helping you have this meeting. And you want to make sure that you're courteous the whole time. And when they are a legislator, you want to be formal and be put together. And you also want to make sure that you're sucking up to them just a little bit, but just a little bit. And then you want to follow up on that ask. Super important. The ask, as we said, is essential, just as essential as the follow-up is. The ask, it could be, you want to have a hearing, you want them to vote yes for the Green Amendment, you want them to be a co-sponsor, whatever that specified ask is that Swan and I and David kind of discuss with you and decide, that ask is going to be what you're following up with them on. And then the meeting content, don't worry, I promise guys, I'm going a little bit into depth here, but this is just a really important section, and meetings are our key tactic moving forward. So I'm just trying to make sure that you get a good understanding, but we're almost to the end. So obviously the Green Amendment is important for any of this. You can't go into a meeting without knowing the Green Amendment content or whatever issue you're talking about. So legislators presumably may ask you further questions on the Green Amendment at that meeting. So for example, you might have a presentation going, and then at the end you ask maybe for questions, or they're likely going to ask questions since they're going to be putting their reputation on the line. They're going to be supporting this, and they want to understand what they're supporting, and that's reasonable. So to prepare, you want to be prepared. This is kind of like the rights thing. Prepare seems like the word we continue using during this lobbying section. Prepare. So to prepare for yourself, you want to review the Green Amendments for the Generations Frequently Asked Questions document. I believe that's in the folder that I shared in the chat. That document is super important, and it will really just help you get an overall understanding of what might be some good answers to some of those questions. And also on that note, Daniel and I just recently recorded a podcast episode. The next episode is going to be on frequently asked questions about the Green Amendment, both maybe supportive and also critical questions. So if you're interested in, reviewing that, but not so much in a reading way, but in like a listening and auditory way, then that will also be posted soon. So make sure you check that out on Spotify. So some of these recently or frequently asked questions include like what other states have a Green Amendment. That would be pretty simple. Say New York, Pennsylvania originally, and Montana. And then onto terms such as pure water, too broad. And actually, that's not true. Pure water is not that broad. If you consider the other constitutional rights in the Bill of Rights section, they're all broad for a reason. Like, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, those are all pretty broad. And being broad is kind of the purpose. You want to ensure that they can be determined and used for a variety of different cases in a variety of different places across the nation in situations. So it's really the court's kind of their responsibility and duty to interpret those. And that kind of is one pitfall of the Green Amendment, to be honest. It could be interpreted in a way that is not supportive. However, it is within, like, the general rules of the Constitution, that the status quo of the Constitution rights to kind of be broad. And then will Green Amendment hurt the businesses and the economy? And this is pretty simple, no. Obviously you can just give a short excerpt, like in Pennsylvania and Montana, we're not seeing the Green Amendment hurt businesses or the economy. If they're really concerned about that, you can say how in Pennsylvania, they're really big on fracking, sadly. And if you have to, pitch it this way, you can kind of say that, the Green Amendment, after it has been still enacted into the state constitution, there continues to still be some fracking. So it's not fully harming and stopping any, industries, even if they are environmentally, poor, bad for the environment. So Swan's going to go over now some key advice, and this is our last section.
Yes, so just very quickly to wrap everything up. First, said this so many times, like Margaret said, but obviously come prepared. You want to look over the following documents and to either learn this material or review it. And if you have other documents for whatever campaign you're working on, definitely review those before the meeting and print out handouts. And if you are going to an in-person event, make sure to bring 2 masks to wear at all times, at least, for while we're in a pandemic. As of now, if you're curious or going to an in-person lobbying event, again, this was originally made for our in-person lobbying event, you need to bring proof of vaccination to enter the New Jersey Capitol building at the moment. And there's no eating or taking off your mask within the State House. And then just some key advice that's kind of more general lobbying stuff. Be confident. You need to be able to steer, whether it be walking up to a legislator in the hallway and saying, hey, can I talk to you about this? Or if you already have a meeting and steering the meeting in the right direction, confidence is really important. Part of that comes with practice. And also just not being nervous, because it's okay. Legislators are people too. And because we're students, there's a little bit of leeway there, but it is really important because leads from personal experience, like Margaret mentioned, legislators will go off track. In my meeting earlier today with Cody, he started talking about some story from when he was younger. He asked what colleges we wanted to go to. He started talking about his own experience growing up in a neighboring town. It was kind of crazy. So it takes confidence to be able to steer the conversation back around to what you want it to be, because as much as we do want to build personal connections to legislators, we also don't want to waste all of our time and have them leave the meeting without having actually gotten to our ask yet. So speak slowly, don't shy away from eye contact, that sort of thing, and talk about why you're truly passionate about the Green Amendment, because or about whatever issue you're talking about. Make it less scripted. Focus on like your own personal reasoning, because when you talk about yourself, that passion shines through. It makes you more confident when you know what you're saying and when you really care about it. Clothes also play an important role in confidence and how people perceive you. So it's great to wear semi-formal clothing. Even if you are just joining a Zoom meeting, it can be really helpful to get you in the right mindset, particularly if it's something like, at least for me, I went into my meeting right after school. So I had to search for a quiet room and stuff like that. So it was good to have that confidence to get settled, to find a quiet space, and formal clothing can help you kind of set the mood and be confident.